we have seen Tropical Storm Alberto, which ran across the Gulf of Mexico, Hurricane Beryl, which developed off the coast of Africa and made its way through the Caribbean as a tropical storm before turning north and missing Bermuda to our west, and Hurricane Chris, which developed off of the East Coast and traveled north between the United States and Bermuda. The Bermuda Weather Service and EMO were focused on both Beryl and Chris in case the track changed and warnings had to be issued for Bermuda, which fortunately they were not. It is pleasing to see the number of stakeholders in the room today. The more informed our stakeholders are, the better prepared we are as a country to prevent death, injury, and damage. At this point, I would like to introduce the new Commissioner of Police, Stephen Corbishley, who, as Commissioner, is the Director of Operations for the EMO. I will now invite him to say a few words.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As I said, my name's Steve Corbishley. I'm the new Commissioner of Police. Second week here in Bermuda. Lots of people have asked how am I getting on. I've said it's a bit of a whirlwind, so the fact that I'm discussing hurricanes today is probably quite timely, the two going together. A bit of background about myself, UK police officer, experience of working in civil contingencies and disaster management. So whilst that's not to say I'm any expert, I've got some familiarity to step into the role as Director of Operations. I did ask Steve just before around some key points that perhaps I should cover, and his comment back was, well, you know the drill. So actually that's a really important point. Do we know the drill? And one of the opportunities today is to build the relationships between us in the variety of different roles that we undertake, to gain familiarity and knowledge as to who we are, where we are, and what we can do. Because certainly my experience, and I'm sure there is a vast amount of experience in this room, that when crisis happens, relationships are tested. Familiarity of role, contact, and how people come together very quickly is absolutely essential. Because alongside crisis is often chaos, the chaotic period of time that takes place when you're facing extremely difficult issues. 2 points I just want to raise with you though is, and firstly the most important issue is, the most important stakeholders are local communities. We have a role to protect life, to enable people to get back to normal life, so the recovery process. But it's absolutely essential that we communicate and tell people how they should prepare, how they should protect themselves, and also to warn and inform them about key information that they can take on board to enable them to themselves be prepared. The other issue I raise as well, and certainly my experience in dealing with different aspects of disaster, is often public confidence is not necessarily tested at the point of crisis, it's tested at the point of recovery. So getting people back to normal. And I've seen many cases where people feel that once the crisis is over, they go back to their day job. And communities' confidence actually is about the assistance that's needed, the pastoral care, people that have been displaced from their homes, what we're doing collectively to reassure, to actually respond effectively. So as much as our discussion is going to be about how we prepare and how we deal at the point of the actual crisis, one of the things I'm really keen on is how we collectively work in recovery to support our communities, to get them back to normal and to give them confidence that we're working together to look after them, to protect them and actually enable them to get on with their lives. So I'm delighted to be here. I will look towards you to give me advice. It's absolutely essential we all work to the same commitment and game plan. So at times when we do come together, we're effective, we're professional, and we're good to go. One of the things I often say about meetings, conferences, the most important issue is what we do when we leave. So we're going to receive lots of information today, but I encourage you to pick up those relationships, have conversations. I'm encouraged at the fact that we can do some exercises together. But if you're unfamiliar with how somebody else works, have a conversation with them, get to see them, because those kind of investments are absolutely valuable for the future. So I'll hand over to the agenda. I'm delighted to be here, and I hope you all support the event, which is extremely valuable for us to engage with. Thank you very much.
I will now invite the new Deputy Governor, Alison Crockett, to say a few brief words.
Hello everyone, and I really will be brief because I am in a bit like Police Commissioner, brand new to the island. I'm in week 3, so I'm very much in learning and listening mode. So I just wanted to introduce myself. For those of you who haven't met me yet, please do come either up to Government House or in the midst of this meeting when in break or whatever, say hello. I'm very, very glad to be here. I know that Ginny, my predecessor, was very much involved in this work in disaster management, and it's my hope to be able to also participate as much as I can, help, add value where I can, and just be part of this effort. So thank you for having me, and I'm very much looking forward to working with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Deputy Governor. Hurricane predictions for 2018 were first issued in May. At this time, it was forecasted that the hurricane season would be near or above normal. In the first half of August, the major hurricane prediction agencies have issued their latest and last forecast for this hurricane season, and have lowered their expectation for the number of hurricanes expected. I will now hand over to Steve Cushion, the National Disaster Coordinator.
Before I hand over to Michelle Pitcher and James Dodgson for the meat of why we're here today, I just want to introduce you to 2 people. And I'll ask Kelly Trott and Lyndon Rayner just to stand up and show your faces. One of the best reasons we're here today is networking. There's a lot of important people here who we will email. Just stand up, sorry, face the others.
Together, guys, together.
We're going to receive emails and telephone calls, and it's really nice to put a face to the person on the other end of the phone or the email. So you've met the new police commissioner, you've met the new deputy governor. So Kelly is going to be taking a big role in disaster management, or disaster risk reduction and mitigation, which the title likes to be, because you can't manage a disaster, you can only mitigate it and reduce it. And Lyndon's going to take over a lot of the work on national events coordination as well. So they're going to be assisting me and working with me. So you may not get emails or telephone calls from me, it may be one of these 2. And Kelly's sent a lot of emails out and telephone calls about this meeting today. Thank you. But on that note, at the end of this meeting, please take time and introduce yourselves to other people, because one of the reasons we're here today is to shake hands and get to know the people on the other end of the phone or the email who you're going to receive correspondence for, and it's a lot easier to do it when you can pick up the phone and call somebody and there's a familiarity there. So I'm now going to hand over to Michelle's up first, Michelle Pitcher, the Deputy Director of the Bermuda Weather Service.
Good morning, everybody. So I've been with the Weather Service about 10 years now. You're probably more familiar with my name on the forecast than instead of associated with management. But I've been in this role almost a year, and I'd like to think I'm a little bit more settled down. Also, you probably recognize my voice a little bit more from radio interviews. So now you can put a face to the name. So I'm starting off our weather presentation. I'm going to tell you a little bit of background about the Weather Service, give you a little knowledge about the way hurricanes form, and some other little tidbits, or tropical tidbits, as one of our favorite websites likes to call them. Okay, so weather service coordination. So we have our beloved Bermuda government up top, of course. And then under the government, we have the Bermuda Airport Authority, Skyport, one of our main customers. And then, of course, the reason we're here today, talking about the with our National Disaster Coordinator and the Emergencies Measures Organization. Now, with all of these bodies, they talk to our parent company, CI Squared Aviation Bermuda. Bermuda Weather Service is a department of CI Squared Aviation, and CI Squared Aviation has actually been contracted to provide services such as weather forecasting. Now, once we get to our Bermuda Weather Service, what do we do? Well, besides the very important tropical updates, watches, and warnings, we also provide aviation forecasts for the airport. We do NOTAMs, Notice to Airmen, and flight plans, and aviation watches and warnings. And all of our products related to aviation are on our special aviation website. What you may be more familiar with is our public and marine forecasts and watches and warnings. And we also do specific marine yacht charts, and we do yacht briefings. So besides a briefing for the Newport races, the Marion Bermuda race, the Annapolis to Bermuda race, if there's any transiting yacht captains, we do provide briefing services for them, just to let them know what kind of conditions they're going to expect when they're leaving or coming to Bermuda and what they might see during their transits. Now, for all of that information, you can find it easily on our website, weather.bm. We also have our TV channels, and the local radio and newspapers also reproduce our forecasts. And finally, one of the other things we provide, which not a lot of people are aware of, is we maintain a climatology database for Bermuda. So somebody's got to keep track of all the highs and lows and all the record rainfall and all of those kind of fun statistics like that. All right, so hurricanes. Bermuda in the Atlantic Ocean, of course, isn't unique in getting tropical cyclones. And so this map just shows us the basics of where all sorts of tropical cyclones around the world are formed. Also, one note is, whoops, oh dear. Spoiler alert. Okay. All right. One thing to note, when you're looking in some of the other basins, they call them cyclones. Or if we're looking closer to China and Japan, they call them typhoons. But these are all just different names for the same type of system. So they're all tropical cyclones. And they generally form, as I have so helpfully put down here, between 5 and 15 degrees latitude, north and south from the equator. And then once they develop, they tend to go easterly away from their origin. Okay, so we talk a lot about these agencies that do predictions for what the season's going to be like. And this is a very technical slide, but I just wanted to bring it up to show you some of the main things that all of the research scientists are talking about when they're trying to make their seasonal predictions. So they worry about whether there's warmer oceans up in the north, whether it's a warmer ocean down in what we call the main development region, whether it's a very strong, wet African monsoon. Then you usually get a little bit more active hurricane season, so you have a lot more tropical cyclones developing. Or opposite, if there's cooler ocean temperatures, especially in what's called the main development region, so between the Lesser Antilles and the coast of Africa, and also the African monsoon. So a lot of different factors affect what's going to happen in our Atlantic basin. Also, El Nino and La Nina, you hear these words a lot, but they are major influences as well. If it's a La Nina year, then we usually have cooler and dry waters in the Pacific. And how does the Pacific affect the Atlantic Ocean? Well, that decreases the wind shear. And if you think about wind shear, if you have like a pot of water boiling, or you see smoke from a campfire, if you wave your hand around it, that disturbs it. Well, that's wind shear. So in order for tropical cyclones to build into proper hurricanes, they can't have any disturbances like wind shear. And of course, opposite of La Nina, El Nino, when it's really warm and wet in the Pacific, then that does create more wind shear in the Atlantic. So even though it's El Nino and La Nina affects a different ocean basin, that's a wider effect that just affects more global oceans as well. So a lot of these things the climate scientists are looking at when they do their predictions. So basic ingredients for a tropical cyclone. Warm sea surface temperature. It needs to be at least 26 degrees Celsius or 80 Fahrenheit. We need a moist and unstable atmosphere. So tropical cyclones have a lot of rain, they have thunderstorms, so they need all of that moisture. And unstable means they can rise and develop into heavier showers and thunderstorms, much like we would just see regularly sometimes in the summertime here. We also need pre-existing disturbance, and that's a bit more of a technical name for having a tropical wave off of the coast of Africa, or there's old cold fronts if they're developing closer to our area. Sometimes there's features called upper tropospheric troughs, so they need a little bit of a spark, a little bit of seed to help them develop. And of course, like I said, a low wind shear environment. So just like you have your hot cup of coffee or tea in the morning, and it's warm and moist, and the steam is steadily rising up, that's the same basic type of conditions that tropical cyclones need to develop. Now, we talk a lot about the Bermuda Azores High in our weather forecast, and it is technically a subtropical ridge. So with Bermuda here and the Azores over here, the center of that high also plays a key role on driving or steering the path of these tropical cyclones. And also depicted off here, this is Africa. So there's tropical waves that steadily come off of Africa during the hurricane season. And remember, like I said, we had need a little pre-existing disturbance while there's usually plenty available this time of year. So the center of the Bermuda Azores High, it migrates east and west throughout the seasons, and generally it's more westerly, so centered over Bermuda, giving us the calm, subtle days with light winds and a lot of sunshine. But once we get into the second half of Atlantic hurricane season, later this month and into September and October, the center of the ridge is a little bit more easterly. And then without the strong ridge kind of protecting us, it leaves a lot of area open for tropical cyclones just to recurve, we call it, and swing up and come past Bermuda. So that's, again, one of the another major factors why we have to worry a little bit more this time of year, although we could be impacted any time of year by a tropical cyclone. And again, main development region. We're going to talk about the MDR a lot, and really between the Lesser Antilles and Africa, where we have a lot of those pre-existing disturbances. So, tropical cyclone terminology. Tropical cyclone is the basic phrase for all of these different types of disturbances, but they're actually broken down into a little bit more technical terms. First, once you start developing any kind of cyclone, it becomes usually a depression, depending on how fast it's developing or not. And a tropical depression is just a cyclone in which the sustained surface winds is 33 knots or less. Now, once those winds increase, that's when it's upgraded to a tropical storm, which is still a type of tropical cyclone. But again, the wind speeds for the tropical storm are between 34 and 63 knots. If it is still intensifying, then it becomes a hurricane. And a hurricane, again, tropical cyclone, but this time is when the average speeds are 64 knots or higher. And then finally, like unfortunately what happened a lot during last year's season, the hurricanes intensify to major hurricanes. And that just means that the mean speed winds are 96 knots and higher. And just a little note under here, this also includes subtropical storms. So we have tropical depression, tropical storms, and subtropical depressions and subtropical storms. And that just means it's a little bit more of a hybrid, and they usually happen a little bit further north, like in Bermuda's area and more north. So kind of a minor point, nothing that anybody has to worry about unless you're studying these. That's our job. So I talk a lot about tropical waves. Here's our textbook depiction of a tropical wave, but obviously this is not what we see in the ocean. So instead, we look at satellite imagery. So this is from the new GOES 16 satellite. We've got high definition satellite imagery this year with the new satellite, and it's been wonderful. So just to help orientate you, here's the coast of Africa, here's northern South America, and then we have the Caribbean. Now if you look here, this white area, this is an area of clouds, and down here, this is what the tropical waves look like in real life. So this is what we're going to be seeing on satellite imagery. Not very impressive, just kind of concentrated areas of showers and thunderstorms. And then if we zoom in on one, so this, again, the seeds of all of our tropical cyclones start off very innocently looking. So we always look at satellite imagery, and we're looking down on top of the hurricanes and tropical storms, and they have this beautiful swirl of clouds, but what actually is going on inside them? So this is just a cross section. If you could go and see right into the side of one of these cyclones, there's actually complex circulation going on around there. So we have the eye in the middle, and it's surrounded by the rising warm air, and this creates the cirrus shield that covers most of the tropical storms and hurricanes. So that's what we usually see on the satellite imagery. But remember, we also talk about rain bands, and there's bands of rain embedded within these cyclones. Well, that's because there's many secondary circulations that exist far out from the eye of the hurricane. And it's these rain bands that we also need to watch, not just the main body of the storm. Because that's when, especially in hurricanes that are a little bit more Category 2, Category 3 and higher, they can have even embedded tornadoes. So just because the center of a hurricane might not be impacting your area, if you're one of these rain bands that are a little bit more active comes over you, then we can still have a lot of terrible effects from it. So back to satellite imagery. And as our junior secretary, Jason Hayward, was talking about, one of our hurricanes, Nicole, that impacted Bermuda. And here is the eye of the hurricane. So very clear for those of us that have been in the eye of some of these past hurricanes. We know that the winds drop down, it gets very silent, and sometimes the stars come out depending on the structure of the hurricane. But then again, wrapped around it is all of those rain bands and all of those strong gusty winds, heavier thunderstorms, potential for tornadoes. All of that is just hidden under there. And really, these tropical cyclones can be any kind of size. Because if you look here, Bermuda is just this little tiny yellow smudge. And just the eye of Nicole is wider than Bermuda. So a lot of different factors for us to consider when any one of these cyclones are coming near. And yet another thing to add to the mix, what side of the island is this tropical cyclone going to pass? So if you think about the forward motion of a hurricane, it's going south to north, and the winds are swirling around the hurricane. So on the right-hand side is also the strongest winds of the storm, because you have both the forward momentum of the entire system as well as the internal circulation of it. So that's a thing to consider, whereas when you're coming on the other side, the winds are going from north to south, and so that cancels out a little bit of the strength of the forward momentum. And so when we're really got the eye of a hurricane coming near Bermuda, we've got to be careful and see which side is it going to be passing, because again, I could intensify or maybe slightly weaken the overall wind strength of the entire system. Okay, and storm surge. So we don't get classic storm surge like we see in the US and some of the other islands. We don't have a long continental shelf. We're just a little tiny bit of rock and coral poking out of the ocean. But there still is wind-driven surge. So all of these strong winds blowing with the hurricane in the same direction, it is piling up the ocean water along with it and taking this bulge of water. And so depending on high or low tide and when this hurricane is going to be affecting us, this bulge of water can cause a lot of damage or maybe a little bit of damage. So again, it might not be classic storm surge. We can't forecast it the way they do in the US, but we always know it's there, and then we always add that extra little bit of detail. Hey, this is going to impact us on high tide, so the water level is already going to be high. Maybe expect extra flooding, maybe expect extra boulders being brought up from the ocean. Or if it's going to be happening at low tide, then okay, while there might be the storm surge coming if the tide is low, and if we might be lucky and have an extra low tide, then maybe the overall water level won't be raising too high when it comes to Bermuda. All right, so National Hurricane Center, we work closely with them throughout the tropical season, and they are located in Miami, Florida, for those of you that don't know. They're in charge of the entire Atlantic basin, so they're the ones that are watching all of the different tropical waves, tropical disturbances. They're the ones that are specialized in declaring when anything develops into a tropical depression or tropical storm. And they put out forecasts, much like this one that was from last year, where you can hover over areas that they're watching, and they'll also label any current active storms. And then you can get a little bit of information about what they're thinking, what's going to happen with all of the areas they're watching. Now, Bermuda, we are in charge of our local forecasts and our local watches and warnings. And that is done in conjunction with National Hurricane Center. We are on the phone with a hurricane specialist. They take our information with our local knowledge of how past tropical storms and hurricanes have affected Bermuda, and then we take their level of expertise, because they're the ones that would be studying all of these systems as they develop, and we combine that to give the best possible products to issue for Bermuda. All right. So every year, the National Hurricane Center does a little bit of updates on their products, and there's different things that they are able to put out to help everybody understand exactly what they're trying to tell you about all of these tropical cyclones. So one thing for this year is their public advisory. They're now going to include their forecast information beyond the normal 48 hours. That's only 2 days. So now they're going out to 72 hours and up to 5 days. So when there's high confidence in the computer models on what they're saying is going to happen with any tropical cyclone, the National Hurricane Center now have a higher confidence, and they're able to give people more information further out in time. So then we can get more warnings, be more prepared, have just that little bit of extra time to get ourselves situated. Also, the wind radii forecast. So this is how far from the eye of a storm that the tropical storm force winds or hurricane force winds are extending all around the cyclone. So now they can actually put out 72 hours. They're confident with the models on how wide of an area is going to be affected by the different wind categories. And for the hurricane force winds, they can go out to 48 hours now. So again, all this little extra detail, even if it was only 6 hours instead of another whole day, that's 6 more hours that they would give us, and then in turn we can give you to help prepare. And finally, they last year had this experimental product about arrival time of tropical storm force winds, and now these graphics have gone through a season of testing, and now they are fully operational, and we'll look at those in a minute. And again, just a reminder from last year, because it's a little bit of a new thing and not everybody might remember. So they started doing potential tropical cyclone warnings. So if there is a disturbance that they do expect is going to develop into a tropical cyclone, but it hasn't quite made it yet, if it's going to impact the Caribbean islands, if it's going to impact the US, if it's going to impact Bermuda, we're able to do watches and warnings based on a potential tropical cyclone. Again, just trying to add that little bit of extra time to give everybody a heads up so they can be fully prepared for any kind of event that's happening. So going with the arrival times of winds, we now see on the Hurricane Center they have the earliest reasonable arrival time of specified winds, in this case tropical storm force winds. So they have dates and a timeline from the origin of the storm. And then they also have the most likely specified time of the winds. So a little bit of a subtle difference between the two. But we in Bermuda, we've always forecast the most likely arrival time. And if there's any uncertainties that would encompass the earliest reasonable times, we do try to convey that in our briefings, in our forecasts, in our forecast discussions. So we also have specific wind timings available to us internally, and then we disseminate all of that information as well to local agencies. And James will touch a bit more on that in a bit in his section, so I can't steal all of his thunder here. Okay, moving on. Threats, watches, and warnings. So we kind of do two different types of classifications of warnings when we expect a tropical cyclone coming toward Bermuda. We talk about potential threat versus threat, and that is related to the distance of the center of the tropical cyclone to Bermuda. So if it's a potential threat, they were like, right, within 72 hours, the next 3 days, the center of the cyclone is going to be within 400 nautical miles of Bermuda. That sounds pretty far away, but if we remember from that satellite image of Hurricane Nicole, just the center of the isle alone was the size of Bermuda. So when we have these really large tropical cyclones, 400 nautical miles away is nothing. We can still be very severely impacted. And then we upgrade a potential threat to a threat when the center of the cyclone is expected to be within 100 nautical miles of Bermuda, or the effects of the cyclone itself, because remember, these can be quite large, are expected within 72 hours. And then we have our wind speed watches and warnings. So we have tropical storm or hurricane watch, which means within 48 hours, so it's a different time from 72 to 48, is when we're going to say, okay, we're possibly going to be experiencing tropical storm force or hurricane force winds. The watch gets upgraded to a warning within 36 hours if we're still saying, right, this is how everything is looking, this is what the National Hurricane Center specialists are saying, that we are going to be impacted within 36 hours with tropical storm winds or hurricane force winds. So all of these can be updated as much as every 3 hours, depending on the type of the system. And again, just as a side note, subtropical storms also are covered into this category of watches and warnings. So for implementation, when it's time to go time, and things are going to be happening. We got our T plus 72 hours before a tropical cyclone impacts Bermuda. So we've already at BWS have been monitoring systems, and we've been talking with NHC. We've been looking at other sister agencies for information. We are going to be liaisoning with the National Disaster Coordinator, with the BAA, Skyport, on tropical cyclones moving toward Bermuda as necessary. So we are already briefing people, we are already looking at the details, we're getting the word out there to the main stakeholders that are our primary responsibility. 72 hours out, if we deem that a cyclone is a threat or potential threat, then we're doing emails to the EMO executive, also the National Disaster Coordinator, the BAA, Skyport, MAROPS, and then we also start doing in-person and video briefings. So James and myself will be the main ones in charge of the briefings, and we'll be going out telling everybody this is what we're seeing, this is what's happening, this is what we've discussed with the National Hurricane Center. We'd be available to answer questions, and then we can lend, this is the confidence in the forecast is high or low or in between, and what do you need to prepare for? 48 hours out is when we'll be issuing the tropical or hurricane watches and warnings. We'll watch if we're expecting it, continuing to email and do briefings. 36 hours is when watches do get upgraded to warning. And again, every time we do any changes, we're sending more email updates, we're scheduling more briefings, trying to keep everybody as up to date as possible. And then really from 36 hours out until the time that the tropical cyclone arrives, we are just continuing with all of our updates. We do our forecasts of the onset and cessation timetables, so we can try to give people the approximate times to expect when the winds are going to arrive and when they're going to decrease. We do that for the marine area, for the island itself, and for the airport. Now, CPA, closest point of approach. So that's when the center of a cyclone is going to be at its closest to Bermuda. So depending on how close this is, but at the CPA, we always know that this is the potential for the strongest winds. This is 0 time. We're going to have the highest swells, might see the passage of the eye. This is where we're going to see a lot of the storm surge that can happen. Everything is going on. Now, let's say this was a hurricane. Once the hurricane force winds decrease, then we're downgrading our warnings from a hurricane to tropical storm warning. Finally, once the winds drop below tropical storm force strength, 34 knots, that's when we downgrade the warning to a small craft warning. And then finally, once all of the winds are down below significant, we'll downgrade it to a small craft warning, but then people might not necessarily need to go out right away. So we're still talking to the National Disaster Coordinator, different agencies to say, right, how are the roads looking? How is the airport looking? But finally, once we're sure that we're clear of all of any stray thunderstorms, any heavier rain band showers, any stronger gusts of winds, then we will give the all clear for the weather side anyway. And then that will allow people to be able to go out and inspect the airport, inspect the roads. If there's any emergencies that happens, it's more safe for them to go out. And just as a little side note, Bermuda Weather Service staff, we actually stay at the office for the duration of the event. And this maintains continuity for our 24-hour operations. So all of our staff that are going to be working the different shifts at the storm, we are sleeping at the office. We have a full kitchen, we have our lockers, we have a training room that we put inflatable beds in, we have our shower. We are right there, so we always have fresh forecasters ready because we do work 12-hour shifts. So 6:30 to 6:30, 365 days a week, holidays included. Nobody gets a break at the Weather Service. So we will always be there, and even if we can't communicate very well, there's still, rest assured, somebody here keeping an eye on the island. All right, so that's it for me. Now we'll have our director, James Dodgen, come up and give you a little bit more of the nuts and bolts about the current season. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. That was an excellent introduction. Good morning, everybody. For those that may not have met me, I have been director at the Bermuda Weather Service for just a year now. I took over from Kimberly Zool. I've been at the Weather Service for almost 12 years, so I've had quite a lot of experience, experienced quite a few of these systems, these tropical storms and hurricanes. Prior to that, I was at the UK Met Office for 7 years, and then before that, I did a master's in meteorology, so I've been in the industry about 20 years. So what I'm going to look at today is I'm going to review the 2017 hurricane season, which was very active in other parts of the world, but not for us, thankfully. And then I'll obviously look at the current season, what we are looking forward to for the rest of the season. I'll look at the predictions, the climatology for Bermuda. I'll look at our operations, give you an overview of how we operate, and Michelle's touched on a couple of things already. How we communicate. So, this is a summary of last season, and as you can all see, incredibly busy, lots of lines. These are basically showing you the tracks of various systems, tropical storms, hurricanes, and some of the major hurricanes. We all remember how significant last year was in terms of those major hurricanes, Irma, Maria, and so on, and the purples indicate where those major hurricane tracks were. Bermuda's up here, and really the main thing to draw out from this slide is there's a big gap around Bermuda. So we were very much let off last year, and certain parts of, obviously, the Caribbean were very unfortunate. So, as I mentioned, very active in parts of the Caribbean, especially along the US Gulf Coast and parts of the Caribbean there. Now, we normally have 12 systems a year, whether they're tropical storms or hurricanes, or major hurricanes. 12 named storms, and last year we had 17, so quite a lot more active, and I'll come on to the reasons why in a moment. However, as I mentioned, for Bermuda, very quiet season, and for the first time in 10 years, we issued no tropical storm watches, hurricane watches, or warnings. This just really says it all. This is a satellite image showing 3 hurricanes in our basin, in the Atlantic Basin last September. We all remember Irma being a Category 5, a monstrous system. Jose was downwind of that, and then we had Katia affecting the Gulf. This was the predictions from NOAA last year. They're the US agency that we follow, and they were going for a more active than average season. The numbers I just want to call upon are the 14 there. So they were expecting 14 named storms essentially, so slightly more than the average of 12, and the same, slightly more than average for the hurricanes and the major hurricanes. We expect normally 6 hurricanes to develop out of those 12, on average 12 named storms, and then up 2 to become major hurricanes, and all these numbers were slightly up. And the reason was, and Michelle talked to you a little bit about this earlier, was this the El Nino or La Nina. So last season, there was an expectation of a weak or non-existent El Nino, which leads more to a La Nina, and that means we're looking at less wind shear in that main development region that, again, Michelle talked to you quite extensively about, and that allows these systems to develop in the main development region of the tropical Atlantic, and that's why we saw such significant impacts to the Caribbean, the Lesser Antilles especially. We also had slightly warmer than average sea temperatures. Sea temperatures are very important. As you saw from Michelle's presentation, you need sea temperatures of at least 26 degrees Celsius, around 80 Fahrenheit. That's the fuel to these systems. So if you have warmer sea temperatures than average, that adds extra fuel to systems and leads to these major hurricanes, category 3 or more. So everyone's often interested in the numbers for the season, so I will run through this with you. This is our climatology, as I've talked to you about briefly, the last 30 years essentially. So every season, between the 1st of June, end of November, we expect 12 named storms. Out of those 12 named storms, we can expect 6 to become hurricanes. Out of those 6 hurricanes, we can expect 3, up to 3, to become major hurricanes. Last year's tally was extremely active, as you can see, 17 named storms, 10 hurricanes, of which 6 became major hurricanes. The previous year was more active than average as well. And as I stated, last year was more active largely due to that weakening El Nino. It was interesting because right at the beginning of the season, there was an expectation that El Nino would develop. As we got towards the mid part of the season now, it was clear that El Nino wasn't developing, and that is obviously when things started to really ramp up late August into September with those systems. We talked about wind shear, and I won't go into that too much, and sea temperatures. As I said, that's what adds the extra fuel. This is a summary chart looking at the last 7-8 years or so of activity for the whole of our basin. And you can see the numbers vary quite a bit. We've had some very active seasons and we've had some not so active seasons. Now, what's really interesting is if we superimpose the impacts that Bermuda's seen in those years. Hurricane Igor 2010 was quite a long event, long duration event. Not especially damaging, but it was a long duration event. And that was obviously in a very active season with 19 named storms. Faye and Gonzalo 2014, the season was significantly below average. And that was arguably our most impactful year since 2003 and Hurricane Fabian. So we then had Joaquin in 2015, Nicole 2016, with the number slightly below average, slightly above average. The main thing to really draw out from this chart is it honestly doesn't matter what the seasonal predictions are for our part of the world particularly, and I'll come on to the detail in a moment of why that is the case. We can be impacted in a hyperactive year or in a quiet year. So looking at this season now, the forecast and why. Climatology I'll touch upon as well for Bermuda. A review of our operations, how we communicate specifically with the EMO before, during and after a tropical cyclone affects Bermuda. So on this chart here, these are the numbers that came out at the beginning of the season that the Senator mentioned. So we have climatology on the left here for our named storms, hurricanes, major hurricanes. We have 4 agencies here. We have Tropical Storm Risk, Colorado State, NOAA, and the UK Met Office. We tend to follow the numbers from NOAA because that's where the National Hurricane Centre is under. They're part of the National Weather Service. What you can see early season was the numbers were average or slightly above average for the most part, average or slightly above. Speed ahead to a few days ago, the latest updates, August updates that Steve said that's one of the reasons we brief now, because we've just had all the latest information in ahead of the height of the season, which is late August, September, October. What do we see? The numbers have actually reduced. In every single agency that's produced more numbers, the UK Met Office only issue one set of figures in May, but the other agencies do repeated forecasts for the season, and we see the numbers have dropped in every single agency. So why? Why have those numbers dropped? They're now below average for this season. Well, there's a continuing signal of an El Nino developing later in the summer. I'll show you a graph on that in a moment. And the surface temperatures have been cooler than average, and they remain cooler than average. As I mentioned, that's the fuel for these systems. El Nino, as we know, tends to impede tropical development due to increased wind shear and also more atmospheric stability. So it's not allowing those storms to really gather and the warm air to rise and spin up into thunderstorms and tropical storms. I don't need to remind you, but I should. It only takes one storm to be a very busy season for us, and I add this cautionary note at the bottom the fact that we issued no tropical watches or warnings last year for the first time in 10 years means we probably will be issuing something this year. This graph is really just showing you an overview of the developing El Nino. As I said, we were weak La Nina last season, and that's why there was so much activity in the Caribbean, especially because there was very little wind shear in that area. But as you can see, this is the current point here in the forecast this is July, August, September, so we're essentially here. And all these are different models, projections, and the general thrust of it is we're going into an El Nino phase, which is above the 0.5 anomaly line there, Celsius. So there's clear indications, as I've mentioned, of this consistent theme of El Nino developing, which will administer more wind shear over the MDR, the main development region. The other thing that's obviously very important that I mentioned about is the sea temperatures, and as we can see from this chart, this is the last month or so of the sea surface temperature anomaly. Bermuda's around here. To our northeast, it's actually warmer than average, but this is the MDR, and we can see there that we have those cooler than average. The blues are cooler than average temperatures, and that's been one of the reasons why we haven't seen any big systems develop in this region so far, because of the enhanced wind shear from the developing El Nino and the cooler than average sea temperatures. And then somebody mentioned to me earlier, another reason is a lot of dust coming off the Sahara tends to stabilize the atmosphere. But a cautionary note on that as well is as we get later into the season, the amount of dust that comes off the Sahara begins to weaken. So that becomes less of an inhibiting factor as we go into September and October. But these certainly are factors, the cooler than the average sea temperatures and the wind shear in this particular region down here. So I've covered that for you. So I'm not really going to talk about this too much because Michelle did cover this, but what we are expecting, as I said, is El Nino now looking increasingly likely to develop later this season, which relates to fewer hurricanes, particularly in this area. Look, you've got to sort of focus on where that area is. And then in last year, 2017 season, because of La Nina being in effect, there were more hurricanes in that general area. So this is an update on what's happened so far this season through mid-July. There have been a couple of others. In this general area here, we had Debbie, and we've also had Ernesto develop very recently in this area here. Not a threat to any land areas at the moment, certainly not a threat to Bermuda. But this is an update up to mid-July. And what we can see here is, obviously, I've highlighted Bermuda there. And we see some tracks. I don't think this is working so very well. This is a track of, this was Beryl, and this is quite interesting because Beryl developed in the MDR. This is when it actually became a hurricane, but what you can see is it weakens as it comes towards the Lesser Antilles, and that's because of that enhanced wind shear. And then it recurves around our Bermuda Azores High, and then Bermuda's here, and then just to the north of the Bermuda, we see that orange, and that's where it's redeveloped into a subtropical storm. Part of the reason for that is we've got the wind shear down here, but we haven't got as much wind shear up here. So this is a little bit of a story for us, I think, this season. This was Beryl, as I mentioned, and you've got the enhanced wind shear where it dissipated and then redeveloped around the Bermuda area. And we have seen similar features that have impacted us in the past, like Faye, which came up here as just a small tropical disturbance. And then when it hit the lower wind shear, we've still got very warm sea temperatures in October, it redevelops on our doorstep, as we know, to a hurricane. So that is what we're looking at this season, and this is particularly topical today because there's actually a tropical wave moving across this general area, which is typical, as you know, and the NHC are actually watching that for development. And what they're saying is in about 3 or 4 days, it will tend to dissipate in this area, again, because of that wind shear that I've mentioned. But it's not to say, not with that feature, but with other features later in the season, we'll see that dissipation and then the potential redevelopment up here where the conditions are more conducive. The sea temperatures are certainly warm enough around our area, and if you have that wind shear low enough and the ridge, the Bermuda Azores High Ridge is regress to the east, then that's when we're looking at potential development. Now Steve, National Disaster Coordinator, wanted me to show you this chart because a lot of you, I know, have your weather apps on your iPads and your phones, and you get a lot of this information thrown at you from those apps. So this is quite an interesting example because one of those tracks is coming towards Bermuda. A lot of them are going sort of towards the US coast, the central US coast there. One or two even sort of steer towards northern Florida. So some people some lay persons may make certain assumptions about this chart, or they may say, oh, well, look, this one model's going for a significant system going towards Bermuda. But that's certainly not the case, and really you have to take these with a pinch of salt. These are lots of different model tracks, and it's very much for the experts like certainly the National Hurricane Center and then ourselves to sort of absorb all that information, if you like, and then make very, very educated decisions on which track they want to follow. And generally what happens is, to give you a little bit of background, some of these tracks, some of these models are more reliable than others, and the experts know that, but you may not know that. And so also there's history to the system, there's history to these models, and so that expert input's required for them to make a decision that we obviously follow on exactly out of this spread of all the model guidance, where's it going to go? There's the official track. And generally out to 5 days, that track guidance is very good now. There is, I went to a conference earlier this year, and the general consensus is track forecasting is improving every year. And they're actually, the National Hurricane Center are reducing their cone of error, if you like, for the track. But unfortunately, that's not the same for intensity of systems. So the problem with that is you've got something tracking towards, say, the Caribbean. Their initial thoughts maybe it's going to be a tropical storm. A couple of days later, it's a Category 3 hurricane that was never forecast. So that's where the work still needs to be done by the researchers. And that's why we're doing this, because yes, we can tell you where it's going to go, but it can spin up very, very quickly, and we all need to get together and get organised. So as I said, lots of different computer model information available on the internet. Data can be hard for the layman to interpret. There may be many unofficial opinions out there. All I encourage is just follow the official guidance, National Hurricane Center and Bermuda Weather Service. That's the official guidance. I don't think I need to say any more about that, really. So climatology for Bermuda, this is all quite interesting because of the recent impacts we've had in Bermuda. This is essentially a summary for the Atlantic Basin over the past 100 years. In red, all hurricanes and tropical storms. In the yellow-orange, all hurricanes. And what you can see, this is beyond actually the season. It starts in May right through to December. It's a very, very slow start to the activity, and then we see that peak occurring in early September. And that's really because of all these factors coming together, especially the sea temperatures are driving this. The tropical wave season, those waves coming off Africa peak late August into September. But as you can see, there's another little peak there towards October, and we've had a lot of October impacts recently. Certainly, I had a lot of feedback from people saying, oh, it's October, or we're kind of out of the woods now, aren't we? No, quite clearly not. We are at threat from now, I would say, to November, and I'll show you, well, you can see why. Once we get into November, it really drops off the activity. And this is now bringing it to home. Again, this is Bermuda hurricane impacts within 100 miles for the climatology that goes spans 140 years there or so. You can see we have never had in that time span a hurricane impact in June, which was obviously very good for the America's Cup. And then in July we've only had one. Things start to ramp up, as we know, in August, and we're peaking in September, but the numbers in October aren't far off September. And then the next main thing to draw out is it completely drops off in November. It's not to say we're not out of the woods in November, but we're less likely to have a significant impact. The two and a half months or so we've got ahead of us, those are the times we really have to keep an eye on everything, and that's why we're all here today. And this is just looking at both tropical storms and hurricanes for Bermuda. And we can see once again there's the peak in September, but numbers in October are still very high before they drop off significantly into November. This just gives you, excuse me, an overview of the climatology month to month. And really what you want to focus on is the orange colours. The red dot is Bermuda, So August, things are just getting going. We're into the likely and the blue. September, we're in that orange. We're in the firing line. We're in Hurricane Alley, as we call it, and that's because the Bermuda Azores high is starting to retreat eastwards, allowing us to get into that sort of general track area. And it's fairly similar for October. We're still under the orange, and then by November, things really dissipating quite considerably. So just a reminder of new Bermuda Weather Service and National Hurricane Centre policies. Us, in collaboration with the NHC, will be able to issue watches and warnings on tropical disturbances that are not yet a tropical cyclone. This is what Michelle talked about, but they do pose a threat of bringing tropical storm or hurricane conditions to the island in 48 hours. These will be labelled potential tropical cyclones. An example of when this might have been useful was Hurricane Karen in 2001, before my time, which formed on Bermuda's doorstep. The Bermuda Weather Service was able to issue gale and storm warnings, but not the perhaps more impactful tropical warnings for that system. So we'll have that ability now with this new policy from the National Hurricane Centre. And just a reminder to everybody, some people would have received these already, I'm sure, routine emails on active tropical systems that we send out for the likes of Debbie that just developed and Ernesto. Because they're never going to be a threat to Bermuda, we will only send out one email, and then if you're interested in following that storm, you can go to our website and look at our tropical update bulletin. But we don't want to overload you with emails, and we understand that's been an issue in the past. So we'll only email you on systems after the first email if we think they're of concern to Bermuda. Operations, as you know, weather.bm, we do have automated BTC telephone recordings for the weather observation, the weather warnings, the public forecast, and the marine forecast. Some people still use that, and in a hurricane situation, your phone might be the only thing that's working. Radio interviews, particularly 100.1 FM in an event. Myself or Michelle will be updating everyone on that emergency broadcast frequency. Marine VHF Channel 2, that's managed by MAROPS. They essentially record our forecasts, and they get communicated on that channel to the marine community. We're on Cablevision and WOW, Cablevision Channel 4, WOW Channel 100. Social media, we do have a Facebook page as well, and that's quite interesting because in a significant system scenario, we will be adding extra interesting and useful information on our Facebook page beyond the remit of our regular products, if you like. News media announcements, obviously we work closely with the Department of Communications, EMO, to get those announcements out, and we're communicating with the EMO, aviation, marine operations via email, still fax sometimes, phone, and we do have a satellite phone number there as well that is working, which is good. We have full redundancy of our equipment, electricity, communications. As Michelle mentioned earlier, we're 24/7, and in a threat situation, we'll be doubling up with staff. So we have the ability to continue operations when things like the causeway aren't operating or they're shut. I just wanted to highlight one of our tropical update bulletins so people have a bit of an idea. So we issue these for every system that develops in our basin. But we add some extra information when one's going to threaten Bermuda. The main things I want to really draw out on here, I'm sorry this doesn't work, the dotted line is the most likely track of the system. There's a cone, this is what we call the cone of uncertainty. So this was actually Faye, a forecast for Faye, so it could have tracked as far sort of east as that or as far west as that at that particular stage in the forecast time process. And as we know, it actually tracked right over, so it followed that western periphery of that cone of uncertainty. We also have details on the speed, the category, if that's relevant, and then the colours. This is where it currently is at this particular time of this update. The yellow line indicates 50 knots or more, which is obviously very impactful. If it was a hurricane, we'd have a little red area, a red ring in there as well. The blue's tropical storm force winds, and then this shaded areas, fringing tropical storm force winds, as following the track of the system, if you like. So we talked about track and intensity, details on timing, and details also of the closest point of approach that Michelle mentioned within the next 3 days. The system may move closer beyond this period. So if you think if we had something in the deep deep Atlantic, the tropical Atlantic, the closest point of approach in 3 days might not be its closest point of approach during its whole lifespan. But obviously once it's coming quite close, like it is here, the closest point of approach in 3 days, because this was Saturday and Monday's up there, is covered by this highlighted text here. And as it was with Faye, that was in reality it was less than that. But that obviously would have alerted a lot of people that's very close to the island. We have specific data on the system down here, its position in degrees and miles from Bermuda. And we also show the movement, the recent movement of the system, the pressure and the winds, including the gusts. The really interesting thing about Faye was there was a level of complacency on the island when this occurred, because there had been some tropical systems that hadn't been particularly impactful. And if you can imagine a little shift in this system, and if it did develop into a hurricane, and the hurricane force winds are always very near the centre, just a little shift could mean you avoid the worst of it or you're in the worst of it. That's the problem with Bermuda being so small. And there's obviously only a certain level of accuracy we can produce for such a small area. And sometimes we're probably seeing those conditions in the marine area, but not the island. So that is a bit of a challenge, and obviously we try and provide the best information we can. But even with this update, 75 knots is getting towards 90-mile-an-hour gusts, and that will cause significant damage. The feedback I got was, oh, it was only forecast to be a tropical storm. 64 knots is a hurricane. That was forecast to be 60. It's still going to have some pretty alarming impacts on the island if it hits us direct. So just a little bit of feedback on that particular feature. And the other main thing I want to draw out on this image is if we are under threat and we have some warnings issued, we will highlight those actually on the Tropical Update Bulletin in red text. So additional information to the EMO. Myself or Michelle will email the EMO Executive Email Group when a system is expected to affect Bermuda in any way. And regiments are included in that. They're very important in this as well. Weather briefings, as Michelle said, can be provided to the EMO as needed. Before, during and after the event, information will be conveyed via email to the EMO Executive Email Group. We provide onset cessation times of those certain wind thresholds that have certain impacts. Tropical storm force, many things may remain open. Once we get to 50 knots, that can have impacts on transport, schools and so on, and then hurricanes, essentially everything shuts down. And we obviously provide detail on waves, including storm surge and tide levels. If all of those come together at the same time, as Michelle once again said, we can see significant flooding, as we did with Fabian. The very fortunate thing about the recent events we've had, even though there were significant hurricanes, was the storm surge, when it came across Bermuda, coincided with low tide. If we had had a high tide, we would have seen much more flooding. Some of you may remember with Igor, St George's Square was flooded, as well as parts of the West End. So the time and distance of the closest point of approach, and online briefings when the EMO can't convene during the event, or maybe on weekends, short notice events, or during preparations. How can we improve? The united front of information is very important between the EMO, Department of Communications and Bermuda Weather Service. With regards to the communication, this is something we've been doing, working with, or sort of playing around with the last few years, and a sort of impact-based colour-coded system. And really what I'm drawing out here is this is an event. The blue would be when we're getting significant swells from a reasonably distant hurricane that may not be producing any significant winds beyond small craft warning. So we would draw this up as a concern because obviously at this time of year we have a lot of people on the beaches, on the water, and in some events like Ophelia in 2011 we had 20-30 foot swells on South Shore and there was next to no wind. So that would be a good candidate for the blue. Certainly let parks know and the lifeguards. And then if we're looking at that 50 knots, which we would have been doing anyway with Faye, even though it was forecast to be 60 and not 64, we're looking at impacts on parks, education, transport, the causeway, and then red would be that hurricane situation. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, well, thank you to Michelle and James. Is there any questions from anybody on the weather front? Yes, Roger.
The vast majority of the Bermuda population is neither a pilot nor a mariner. You keep talking in terms of knots. Can you give both knots and miles an hour? Essentially, with Fahrenheit 70?
I'll let Steve answer that.
Yeah, so some of the briefings I've been to overseas from the National Hurricane Centre, they sometimes give them in knots and they sometimes give them in miles. And I've been on to them and said, you can't give them in both because it's confusing. You either got to do one or the other. And the vast majority of people understand miles, and I think that's what the population would like. And it is something that they are looking at to change. But until they do that, they're doing the assessment of the data and they're giving it out.
I will just add something, Steve. So in our regular products, we do provide miles an hour as well. So there are details of miles an hour, and the National Hurricane Centre, they'll provide details in knots and miles an hour as well. So when you get into the meat of the products, there is miles an hour there as well.